The silence inside the cell had lasted longer than usual, and that was the first sign something had changed. In a place built on routine, even small deviations carried weight. At the United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility, better known as ADX Florence in Colorado, silence is not unusual. It is engineered. The prison opened in 1994 to house the federal system's most disruptive inmates. Often described as the most secure prison in America, ADX confines men to single cells for up to 23 hours a day. Movement is controlled, monitored, and limited with precision. But supermax confinement is not always permanent. Within the Federal Bureau of Prisons, there are systems designed to evaluate behavior and, in some cases, allow inmates to progress toward less restrictive conditions. That possibility becomes the focus for many men inside. Earning relief from isolation is not automatic. It requires documented compliance, consistent behavior, and patience measured in years rather than months. The federal step-down program at ADX was formalized to provide a structured path forward. It includes multiple phases, each requiring sustained rule adherence before advancement is considered. Inmates begin in the most restrictive housing units, often after violent incidents, escape attempts, or leadership roles in prison gangs elsewhere. Placement decisions follow internal reviews and documented histories. Progression depends on behavior reports written by correctional staff. Refusing orders, possessing contraband, or engaging in threats can reset the timeline, sometimes sending an inmate back to an earlier phase. For some, the first step is simple but difficult. Remain incident-free. No outbursts, no disciplinary infractions, no coded messages passed through vents or recreation cages. The structure is deliberate. Each phase allows slightly increased privileges, such as more out-of-cell time, limited group interaction, or access to additional programming materials. Advancement reviews occur periodically. Case managers, psychologists, and administrators examine disciplinary records and institutional adjustment. But approval is never guaranteed, even after years of compliance. That uncertainty creates tension inside a facility built on predictability. An inmate may believe he has met every requirement, only to learn the review committee reached a different conclusion. Some prisoners have described the step-down program in court filings as opaque. They argue that criteria can feel subjective, particularly when past conduct weighs heavily against present behavior. Legal challenges over the years have questioned whether prolonged isolation violates constitutional protections. Federal courts have generally upheld the Bureau of Prisons' authority, while emphasizing periodic review requirements. In response to litigation and internal evaluations, the Bureau expanded programming options within ADX. Cognitive behavioral workbooks and educational materials became part of documented efforts to encourage behavioral change. Participation in these programs can be voluntary, but refusal may be noted in progress reviews. Engagement signals willingness to adapt, even in an environment with limited direct interaction. The program moves through stages commonly referred to as control unit, intermediate, and transitional phases. Each stage slightly adjusts restrictions, testing whether increased privileges can be managed safely. Transitional units may allow small group recreation under supervision. For men accustomed to near-total isolation, even brief proximity to others becomes a significant milestone. But that milestone can disappear quickly. A single disciplinary report, even for something minor, may pause or reverse progress. Few people outside ever learned how often advancement stalls. The psychological pressure is not abstract. Studies on long-term isolation suggest increased risks of anxiety, depression, and cognitive difficulties. Within ADX, mental health staff conduct regular evaluations. Inmates seeking progression must demonstrate stability during these assessments. Visible agitation, refusal to communicate, or threats toward staff can influence how readiness for transfer is interpreted. Yet not every inmate wants to leave the most restrictive setting. Some have stated in court records that predictable isolation feels safer than less controlled environments in other prisons. For others, the goal is transfer to a high-security facility with more programming and social contact. That transfer requires final approval beyond the ADX administration. The Bureau of Prisons ultimately determines when an inmate is suitable for redesignation. Institutional behavior, sentence length, and security classification all factor into the decision. Time itself becomes a test. Many inmates spend years moving slowly through phases, documenting compliance in daily logs and incident reports. The process is cumulative rather than dramatic. Families sometimes track these changes from a distance, noting when phone privileges expand or when visits shift in format. Small administrative changes signal movement within a rigid system. But even successful progression does not guarantee immediate transfer. Bed space, security assessments, and administrative discretion all influence timing. What followed for some inmates surprised even experienced staff. There have been cases where inmates completed every ADX phase yet remained in federal custody at other high-security facilities under continued restrictions. Supermax is not always the final stop. The design of the step-down program reflects a balance between control and incentive. Officials argue that structured progression reduces violence by offering a measurable path forward. Critics question whether incentives are meaningful when timelines stretch unpredictably. They point to data showing that some inmates remain in restrictive housing for extended periods despite apparent compliance. The Bureau has reported reductions in the overall ADX population over the past decade. Policy shifts and increased oversight have contributed to more formalized review procedures. Still, earning the way out depends on sustained conduct inside an environment where even minor mistakes carry consequences. That reality shapes daily decisions made in near silence. In many cases, the first outward sign of change is subtle. A door opening for slightly longer recreation, a counselor noting consistent participation, a review date circled on paperwork. Behind each incremental adjustment lies a documented record built over months or years. Inside ADX Florence, the path away from supermax conditions is narrow, deliberate, and never automatic. For some inmates, the second phase begins with a door opening to a different unit, one that looks similar but operates under slightly altered rules. The change is procedural, yet deeply significant. In the intermediate phases of the ADX step-down program, inmates may receive increased out-of-cell time, often in secure recreation enclosures. The structure remains controlled, but interaction becomes possible under supervision. Small group recreation, when permitted, is closely monitored. Participants are selected based on compatibility assessments and disciplinary history, and any conflict can result in immediate separation and review. These controlled interactions function as tests. Staff evaluate communication patterns, compliance with movement procedures, and responses to proximity after prolonged isolation. Psychological services staff also play a larger role during this stage. Evaluations assess emotional regulation, impulse control, and the ability to tolerate structured social exposure without incident. Inmates seeking advancement must demonstrate consistency. A single aggressive gesture or refusal to comply with instructions can halt progress and trigger reassessment. Documentation drives every decision. Incident reports, program participation logs, and staff observations accumulate into a record that determines whether privileges expand or contract. Educational materials and self-guided programs remain central. Cognitive behavioral exercises addressing anger management and decision-making are often cited in administrative reviews. Participation alone is not enough. Staff assess whether behavior outside programming aligns with stated goals. Discrepancies between written reflections and daily conduct are noted carefully. For some inmates, this stage introduces expanded communication opportunities. Phone calls and monitored correspondence may increase incrementally as trust is evaluated. But communication itself is scrutinized. Attempts to send coded messages, intimidate witnesses, or maintain criminal networks can immediately reverse earned privileges. The tension lies in the uncertainty of interpretation. What appears compliant to one staff member may be viewed differently by another, and final decisions rest with review committees. These committees examine institutional history alongside recent conduct. Past violence or leadership roles in disruptive groups remain part of the overall assessment. That history does not disappear, even after years without infractions. It influences how administrators weigh the risks of further progression. Legal standards require periodic review of restrictive placements. Courts have emphasized that ongoing evaluation is necessary, but they have also deferred to prison officials' expertise in security matters. As a result, advancement often depends less on a single achievement and more on the absence of negative reports over sustained periods. For inmates serving lengthy sentences, the calculation becomes strategic. Maintaining discipline for years can position them for transfer to high-security penitentiaries outside the supermax environment. Transfer decisions, however, extend beyond ADX administrators. The Bureau of Prisons Designation and Sentence Computation Center evaluates available placements and overall classification levels. Even after internal approval, months may pass before redesignation occurs. During that time, inmates must continue to avoid disciplinary setbacks. Some federal data indicates that structured incentives can reduce institutional violence. Officials argue that clearly defined pathways promote order within highly restrictive settings. Critics remain cautious, noting that long-term isolation can itself affect behavior. They question whether compliance always reflects adjustment or simply adaptation to strict surveillance. Mental health evaluations continue throughout the process. Clinicians document symptoms, coping strategies, and behavioral changes, contributing to the overall readiness assessment. Inmates diagnosed with significant mental health conditions may be considered for alternative placements within the federal system, depending on clinical recommendations. That distinction matters. Not every progression through ADX ends with transfer to a standard penitentiary. Some lead to specialized medical or psychiatric facilities. Security classification scores are recalculated periodically. Factors include institutional conduct, sentence length, and the nature of the underlying offense. But numbers alone do not determine placement. Institutional judgment and administrative discretion remain central to final outcomes. For those who advance to the transitional unit, conditions shift again. Group programming may expand, and limited communal activities occur under close supervision. The transitional phase serves as a final evaluation before potential transfer. It is designed to mirror aspects of high-security facilities while maintaining heightened control. Staff observe how inmates manage increased autonomy within strict boundaries. Failure at this stage can result in return to earlier phases. Few outside the system see how incremental these changes are. The difference between phases may involve hours per week rather than dramatic shifts in daily life. Yet within ADX, those hours represent measurable progress. They signal that behavior has met institutional expectations long enough to justify expanded trust. Not every inmate completes the full sequence. Some remain in earlier phases for extended periods, either due to infractions or administrative determinations. Others eventually transfer to high-security federal prisons where movement, programming, and social contact are broader, though still structured. Even after transfer, monitoring continues. Disciplinary issues at the receiving institution can influence future classification and housing decisions. The pathway out of supermax conditions is therefore conditional, not permanent. Advancement reflects ongoing evaluation rather than a final status. Inside ADX Florence, earning relief from isolation requires sustained compliance in an environment designed to test patience and control. Whether that system represents meaningful rehabilitation or calculated risk management remains debated. What is certain is that progression depends on documented behavior over time, not on promises alone. By the time an inmate reaches the final review stage, years may have passed since his arrival at ADX Florence, and the record being examined reflects thousands of documented interactions. The Bureau of Prisons evaluates whether continued placement in supermax conditions remains necessary. That determination weighs security concerns against demonstrated behavioral stability inside the facility. For inmates who complete every phase of the step-down program, the recommendation may shift toward redesignation. This does not erase past conduct, but it reframes current risk assessments. Transfer typically leads to a high-security United States penitentiary rather than a lower-security environment. Movement remains controlled, though daily life includes more social exposure and programming access. Even at this stage, approval is not automatic. Administrators consider sentence length, notoriety, institutional history, and any intelligence suggesting ongoing risk to staff or other inmates. In some cases, inmates have spent a decade or more in ADX before receiving redesignation. The timeline reflects cumulative conduct rather than a fixed release schedule. Public reporting over the past decade indicates that the overall population at ADX has declined compared to earlier years. Policy adjustments and oversight reviews contributed to that shift. Federal officials have stated that the expanded step-down process encourages compliance and reduces long-term isolation. Internal reviews emphasize structured incentives rather than indefinite confinement. Yet critics argue that the path remains narrow and difficult to navigate. They point to lawsuits alleging prolonged restrictive housing even after documented behavioral improvement. Courts have generally required periodic reviews but stopped short of mandating specific time limits for supermax confinement. As a result, outcomes vary case by case. Mental health considerations continue to influence final decisions. Inmates with significant clinical needs may be transferred to medical centers rather than traditional penitentiaries. Those transfers reflect institutional assessments rather than reward. The objective remains security management balanced with constitutional obligations. For inmates who do leave ADX, the adjustment can be complex. Moving from near-total isolation to a busier environment requires adaptation under continued supervision. High-security facilities still impose strict schedules, but inmates may work in institutional jobs, attend group education programs, and interact more regularly with others. Progress does not end with transfer. Disciplinary infractions in the receiving institution can affect housing assignments and eligibility for further programming. In that sense, earning a way out of supermax conditions is not a single event. It is part of an ongoing evaluation within the federal correctional system. Some inmates never complete the process. Behavioral incidents, intelligence assessments, or administrative determinations may keep them in restrictive housing indefinitely. Others remain in transitional phases for extended periods, where privileges increase gradually but full redesignation remains pending. What makes the system distinct is its reliance on documentation. Every movement, infraction, and program participation entry forms a record that shapes long-term outcomes. Inside ADX Florence, the margin for error is small. A minor violation can delay progression for months or even years, resetting carefully built records. Supporters of the step-down model argue that clear behavioral benchmarks create stability within the institution. Incentives, they contend, reduce violent incidents. Skeptics question whether incentives carry real weight in an environment defined by extreme control. They note that the psychological effects of isolation complicate behavioral interpretation. Federal oversight reviews have emphasized the need for transparency and consistent criteria. Over time, procedural adjustments have aimed to standardize evaluation methods. Yet the fundamental structure remains unchanged. Supermax placement is intended for those deemed the highest security risks in the federal system. Earning relief from those conditions depends on sustained compliance under observation that rarely relaxes. Progress is incremental and subject to reversal. For families and attorneys tracking cases from outside, confirmation of redesignation often arrives quietly through administrative notice rather than public announcement. Within the prison system, however, such movement represents a significant shift. It signals that institutional authorities believe risk has decreased to a manageable level. The silence that once defined daily life at ADX may give way to structured conversation, scheduled work assignments, and broader contact with others. But the underlying sentence remains in place. Transfer does not shorten punishment. It modifies conditions of confinement based on institutional judgment. The broader debate over supermax prisons continues across legal and policy circles. Questions about necessity, effectiveness, and long-term impact remain active. What cannot be disputed is that the pathway out exists, though it is narrow, conditional, and dependent on documented behavior over extended periods. Inside the most secure prison in the federal system, earning the way out of isolation is less about dramatic change and more about sustained, measured compliance. Each review, each report, and each phase contributes to a record that determines whether confinement remains at its most restrictive. For some, that record eventually opens a different door. For others, The silence continues under the same fluorescent lights. If this story kept you watching, the next one will stay with you even longer. Subscribe for more real prison documentaries.